Dragii noștri spectatori de pretutindeni, astăzi vin în fața dumneavoastră cu emoție să vă spun că de ziua mea, 3 octombrie, apar în fața dumneavoastră Constantin Chiriac, cel care dăruiește, să-i spună la mulți ani unui frate mai mare care ne-a dăruit în 2020 Mesia. El însuși, fiind un fel de Mesia în artele spectacolului, și pe care îl sărbătorim pe 4 octombrie. Bob Wilson, unul din monștrii sacri ai artelor spectacolului, creator plurivalent, regizor, actor, scriitor, muzician, creator de operă, de imagine, creator de școală, creator de centru de cercetări, Watermill, unul din cele mai extraordinare locuri din America, în Long Island. Iată-l sărbătorim acum, după ce l-am primit acasă, aici, pe Alea Celebrităților, grație Festivalului Internațional de Teatru, care a creat aici, la Sibiu, locul în care stelele de pe cer fac cu ochiul stelelor de pe pământ. La 80 de ani facem o plecăciune în fața acestui mare creator care a venit la Sibiu să facă o prelegere despre nimic. Nimicul care înseamnă sublimul, fumul aplauzelor, care înseamnă bucuria de a trăi la cea mai fierbinte temperatură a creației, frumosul trecător, care este teatrul, care este spectacolul care aduce această frumusețe nebănuită, miracol, și care înseamnă a dărui, așa cum spuneam și în alte întâlniri, precum soarele. El așa este. Îi mulțumim că este astăzi la 80 de ani, îi spunem din toată inima la mulți ani și îl așteptăm aici, la Sibiu, unde s-a simțit și se simte atât de bine și cărui acestui loc i-a declarat dragoste pe vecie. Îți mulțumim, Bob, încă o dată, din inimă, la mulți ani.
I'd like to say from the very beginning, thank you so much, Robert Wilson, for accepting to have this conversation, albeit in a mediated, non-immediate fashion, using technology and being very far away from one another. And allow me to start with this, because it's something that preoccupies the minds of everybody these days. Distance, isolation, loneliness, but also silence. There are people who fear there is too much silence. But for you, silence is such an important dimension, and you always begin everything with that moment of essential silence. How have you been going through all these challenges that have been emerging lately from the situation that we're all a part of globally?
Well, I think that for me, that's given me a chance to slow down, to look at things differently, to think about things differently, more time to think. And when I first started to work in the theater, that was one of my biggest concerns, is that I would go to the theater and I thought there was never time for reflection, and that it was more interesting to be in nature, to sit in the park and to daydream, to have time to think. And as you might know, and my early works were written with a deaf-mute boy who'd never been to school and knew no words. So the way he understood the world was by listening with his eyes. And that was a root of my work in the theater, and still is. But I think in the current situation where we are now, it's given me time to be in nature. And I'm thinking about producing a work at the Watermill Center now that's not in a theater where people collect all together, but it's a piece I call Walking, where we will just walk through the grounds, the gardens of the Watermill Center, which is situated on Long Island. And if it takes 40 minutes to make this walk, I'm thinking about taking 4 hours to do the same walk, so that our perceptions will be different. The way we listen will be different. The way we see is different because we simply take more time.
Do you think the world today needs more time to process what is happening? Do you think this is actually an advent of grace, in a sense that it's given us the opportunity to reflect more upon what's happening, upon ourselves, maybe? Do you think we should actually cherish this time of reflection rather than be constantly worried about what's going to happen next?
I think so. I think that this maybe could be the most important thing to happen right now, is that we are more alone, so we have time for reflection, and I think that's very important.
But I remember a statement made by Susan Sontag about you, and she said that you never rest, and that she cannot think of you as somebody who can sit down without doing anything. So I'm sure that although you have been isolated figuratively and physically from the world, you have been working. Dare I ask you what you have been working on?
Well, one of the things I'm working on is this piece called Walking. But I had first thought about this experience of walking through the grounds, the gardens of Watermill, to place artworks or to show work of artists and what they're doing today. And I've been thinking about when I went back to Texas to visit my father many years ago, and I grew up in a small town in central Texas. I went next door to visit a neighbor, and I hadn't seen her for many years. And she had a son. He was about 3 years old, and he was sitting in the middle of a large room. And he had his fingers to his eyes, and he was slowly moving the fingers, almost not at all, but looking at the space between the fingers. And I watched him for maybe 10 minutes. And then his mother came, and I said, "Shh," and pointed to the boy, her son. And then after about 20 seconds, she impatiently said, John, what are you doing? And he said, nothing, just nothing. And I've often thought of that moment and how beautiful it was that this boy who was sitting there and alone in a room, and his answer, I'm doing nothing, just nothing.
You know, Beckett, whom you love so deeply, once said, nothing is more real than nothing.
Yes.
And that leads me to something that relates to your work, because you have engaged with Beckett and you have created some masterpieces based on his works. But you've also created this wonderful show that Konstantin mentioned earlier on, Lecture on Nothing. How do you integrate that nothing, which is everything, into the texture of your art?
Well, one of the biggest influences on my work that I'm doing today, happened quite early on, and that's when I met John Cage. And I heard him read his lecture on nothing. And it was a completely different philosophy, a completely different way of thinking. It was not the same as our Western education, which is based on Greek philosophy, but this was more based on Eastern philosophy. And Cage wrote a book called Silence, and that forever changed my life. Cage said that there was no such thing as silence, that sometimes when we're very quiet, we begin to hear more than when we make sound. But there's always sound. As long as we're alive and we're breathing, we can hear our breath. You can hear the beat of your heart. There's always sound. So there's no such thing as silence. And that's very important for me in making a work in the theater. So if you have to speak Shakespeare, if you have to speak a text of Samuel Beckett or whatever, is that you can't begin anything if you begin to speak. In a sense, it's already happening. And I learned from Beckett as well the importance of silence. And that's, I think, one of the keys to his work is the silence.
UNESCO once praised you for going even further than Beckett, for finding that very, very essence of silence and finding a way to express it, to express the inexpressible, as it were. But I'd like to ask you something touching upon an element that you have just mentioned, the idea of Eastern philosophy, of Eastern art. It's an area that has fascinated me in your work. And I'd like to ask you, if possible, to elaborate a bit on these influences. There is so much that you have absorbed but redefined from that huge legacy of Asian performance, Asian culture, Asian thought.
Well, I was very fortunate to go to Japan when I was quite young, and I had already made a few works in the theater, and everyone told me that I must be influenced by the Japanese theater and Japanese aesthetics and philosophy. But I knew nothing about it. And I had grown up in a small town in Texas and was very foreign to me when I first went to Japan. But one thing that I felt was a very close connection. It was like a confirmation of what I was doing. And I worked with a wonderful no actor. I met him, watched him in class, watched him teaching, and eventually had a chance to work with him in one of my productions. And one of the things that I learned from him and confirmed in him was the movement and stillness. And sometimes when we're very still, we become much more aware of movement than when we make a lot of movement. And if we're aware of this interior movement that's within all of us, as long as we're alive and living, if we move outwardly, the line continues. So we can't really start anything, can't really end anything. It will always be going on. Someone asked Albert Einstein once, said, "Mr. Einstein, can you repeat what you just said?" And he said, "There's no need for me to repeat what I just said because it's all the same thought." One of the difficult things to do in the theater is, how do you make a continuous line? If you're the conductor and you have to conduct an orchestra and you have to start music, if you're not listening to the silence and you start the musicians to play, the line is broken. But if you're listening to the silence and then you start to conduct the musicians, the line of sound will continue. And it's the same if you're speaking and not speaking, and then continue speaking. It's one line, because there's always sound. And sometimes, as I said, when we're very, very still, we become much more aware of movement. So that if we're walking on a stage and we stop walking, the movement will continue because we're alive.
I always find it amazingly exciting to listen to you talking about its contrasts, light and darkness, sound and silence, stillness and movement. But there are two dimensions that you always refer to as being the very essence of everything that you do and everything that you think and feel about your work, the vertical and the horizontal. Can you explain what they mean to you and why they're so essential in terms of time and space, in terms of the energy of everything coming together?
Every opposite needs its opposite. So if we take a black object and you put it on another black object, that's one thing. But if you put a white object on the black object, the black will be blacker. So in time, it's something abstract, it's something that I didn't read in a book, it came to my mind eventually. The time was the line that went to the center of the earth and goes through the heavens. And space is a horizontal line. And it's this cross of time and space, this basic architecture to everything. If you play Mozart on a piano, Mozart wrote the music for the Messiah, which you're going to see. If I'm playing a keyboard, a piano, and my finger goes down on a key and up, the sound will go out on a string. And I can touch the piano more aggressively, less aggressively, but it's this tension between this vertical line, my finger going up and down on the key, and the sound that's produced going out horizontally. it's to me a way to stand on stage. Look at a baby. Look at the baby's head, how open it is. The space that's there is open. So this time-space construction, I know it sounds very abstract, to me is based on this vertical and this horizontal. Look at the painting of Vermeer with a drip of milk. There's this vertical line that crosses throughout the curves of the painting. It's a way of structuring space, images.
I would like to ask you something, and that derives from a professional but also personal curiosity. Your body of work is so impressive, so vast, and it includes so much variety beyond the unifying elements of style and creative vision and patterns and so on. What do you start from when you create a piece in theater, in visual arts, in opera? What is, if I am allowed to ask you, the very starting point? Is it always the same starting point, or does it vary depending upon the medium in which you actually create?
Well, I think it's always a mystery how we create and how ideas come to us. In my old age, I think what I try to do if I'm going to a rehearsal room or to work with a group of people, can I think nothing? Can I get all the ideas out of my head? Often I've made preparations and studies. But if I'm in the room and I think nothing, and then I listen to the space, I see the people in the room, and they will guide and direct me as to what to do. And in my older age, I've learned that if I don't have too many ideas before I go to the rehearsal, then I don't waste time. Because if I have an idea of what to do, I spend all of my time trying to make that idea instead of letting it just be and then shape it. The work will talk to you. And I feel that very often that we as directors or creators are talking to the work. Let the work talk to us. It's the way you address a public if you're speaking, not to speak at the public, but with the public. I heard 2 nights ago Barack Obama speak. How beautiful the tone of his voice was, and how he spoke with people. And forgive me for saying this, I heard my president, Donald Trump, speak right after that, and he was speaking at us. I try to start with nothing and see what happens from there.
Is this something that you have reached, that you have gotten to with experience, through struggle, through work, through repetition, through trial and error? Or has it always been there from the very, very beginning of your career?
Well, Octavian, I think it's always been there, but it's more clear in my mind now in my advanced age. So wasn't, if I had gone to a theater school to study theater, I would not be making the kind of theater I'm making. It happened just by chance. And what I do in the theater is unlike what other people do for the most part. But it's been something very personal. I happened to be walking down the street and I saw a deaf kid about to be hit over the head with a club by a policeman. And I stopped the policeman and asked, "Why do you hit the boy?" And he said, "It's none of your business." And I said, "But it is. I'm a responsible citizen." And it turned out to be that he came to stay with me, and he had never been to school, had no formal education, was deaf, and I wrote my first works in the theater with him. And quite by accident, some years later, I met an autistic boy who was writing text mechanically, automatically, based on math and geometry. You could do phenomenal things in math that you and I can't do. He had been institutionalized, and this behavior was being corrected. And my first play with text and words was written with Christopher Knowles. It was just by chance that I met these two young men, and they redirected my life and has given me a great body of work for the theater. And I was fortunate to take the work of the deaf boy from the US to Europe and elsewhere, and the work with Christopher Knowles, the autistic boy. We've traveled worldwide, and they had a voice. This was not something, if I'd gone to the Yale Drama School, that would have happened.
But there are many people today who go to drama school in different parts of the world, and they hope to find something that will enable them to express themselves as artists. And education, although is debatable in theater, in art, is still an important element. Oscar Wilde once said, and I really wish I would once see your version of the importance of being earnest, by the way. Oscar Wilde once said, "Nothing that is worth knowing can be taught." It's a famous quote, and I think you share that view. And yet, school somehow gives people the tools or something for them to base their creative strategies upon. How essential is it actually to study, and how important is it to learn by doing, as you put it once?
Well, there's no one way to learn anything. And some people learn best through a structured environment in an academic situation. Some people don't. Creativity is still a mystery. And how does someone get an idea? We don't know. So for me, I learned by living. I learned by doing. We say in English, you learn to walk by walking. And you can read books about it, and you can study how to walk in a book, but you have to get up and do it. And you learn to walk by falling down. So I think there's really no one way to learn. Sometimes it's by reading a book do we learn, but it's still a mystery.
I think one of the greatest mysteries about you is the energy that you have to genuinely ask that question that you always go back to. What is it? Rather than say what it is. How do you manage to maintain that curiosity alive, despite everything that you know and everything that you have achieved in your work?
The only thing that is constant is change. So that if we're listening to the silence, there'll be sounds that will be occurring that will never, ever happen again. So if we think we know what we're doing, it misses the whole point. Because life is too complex. I learned a lot from Daniel Stern, a psychiatrist who's head of the Department of Psychology at Columbia University. And he made films in the early 60s of mothers picking up babies in situations where a baby would be crying, and he filmed it. So baby would be crying, the mother would reach for the baby, pick up the baby, and comfort the baby. And Stern took the film and slowed it down so that you could see 24 frames in 1 second. And looking at it frame by frame, in 8 out of 10 cases, the initial reaction of the mother when she's reaching for the baby is that she's lunging at the child, and the child is reacting. And the next 2 or 3 frames, next to 3/24ths of a second, the mother is something else again, and the baby is something else again. And the next frame, the mother is something still different again, and the baby's reaction is different again. So that in 1 second of time, it's very complex what is happening between the mother and the baby. Now, the mother, when she sees the film, frame by frame, slowed down 1/24th of a second, is shocked, terrified. She said, "But I love my child." But we see that the body, the language between the body is much more complicated. And in this time we're in now, I think it's important in slowing down to have reflection, and we have different understandings. Our perceptions will be different. The body is moving
so beautiful and
faster
so
than we
interesting.
think.
Sorry, I think we overlapped a little bit, so I'm gonna let you finish. Sorry.
Yeah, the body is moving faster than we think. So the mother thinks she loves the baby, but we see that the language in the body is very different. It's happening quicker.
But what you are describing is a very strange mixture of reactions, but also of feelings,
Yes,
of attitudes.
yes.
Do you think human beings are inherently capable of both good and evil? Do you think we are more inclined towards one or the other, and there is somewhere a shift or a change or a gradual process that influences us? There
Well,
is so much love in your work, but there is also a sense of very objective reality. There is a sense of a very penetrating view upon what is going on with being human. Are we good or are we evil, as far as you can tell? If it's not too peculiar a question to ask.
I think, again, to go back to the idea that every opposite needs its opposite. So heaven can't exist without hell. It's not 2 different worlds, but it's 1 world. And I think that I learned from Cage, and especially when I became more aware of Zen philosophy.
Are you worried about theater's survival as an art form, particularly after what is happening now with this explosion of digital technology that we depend so much on?
No, I'm not worried at all. I think man has a need, has had a need in the past, will have a need in the future to congregate, to come together, and it's in the nature of our being.
And what about what we are experiencing right now at Sibiu Festival, which happens exclusively online? What about so many attempts on the part of so many artists to communicate with their audiences through this mediated platform of internet and everything? How do you feel about that? How do you feel about this process of theater being live streamed and broadcast live and so on?
I think there's no one way to do something. I don't feel comfortable being in that world, but that's my personality. I'd rather take a walk in the garden than to be bombarded by the media. But the only thing, as I said, that is constant is change. So our situation that we're in today will change, will be different.
And what about your own work, Messiah, that we've been talking about? How do you think it will be perceived through this online dialogue with its audiences? And have you ever thought that it would actually be at some point exclusively like this?
Well, what really interested me and in Mozart's Messiah is that it's totally abstract. So so there's a soprano, there is a tenor, there is a bass. We don't know who that person is. We don't know who the character is. There's no situation in which we have to perform. We're not given this situation. It's a time-space construction. And this gives an enormous amount of freedom. So it's not the Messiah where we see Jesus Christ on stage. It wasn't written that way. So it was a kind of freedom for me to direct the work. And so I thought about many things, and the darker sides, the lighter sides. We shouldn't make theater if we can't laugh, and to bring humor to the Messiah was very important. It's a great work. It's amazing that Mozart wrote something when he did that is completely abstract.
You said something about the show in a statement that I read not long ago and it touched me so deeply, particularly in this context. You said that light is the equivalent of hope. That on stage, whether there is light coming from people's hearts or from an electric machine, that is signaling hope. Is there hope there left?
I think without light, there's no space. Light is the most essential element for me in making theater. Albert Einstein said, light is the measure of all things.
There are so many people that have been influenced by you and by your use of light. How do you feel about all these other artists from different generations borrowing, sometimes explicitly, directly, clearly, elements from your aesthetic? Do you ever worry that there is too much imitation going on? Because I can safely say that there is a lot, that there are many, many artists who just pick up one element from your magnificent display of strategies and techniques, and then they make it somehow their own, although it cannot be. Are you concerned about that? How do you feel about all this?
Oh, I think that's how we learn. The world is a library. You can, there's no one way to learn, but look at Matisse. Matisse copied the old masters, came out doing something totally different. And I learned by looking at Matisse, even trying to copy Matisse. I mean, I never could do what Matisse did. I learned by looking at Rembrandt and the contradictions that he made with light within a space. That's how I learned. So the world is a library, and it's okay to copy or to take work from someone else's idea. It's a way of learning, and has been throughout time.
So many people have learned from you, from your works, but there are some very fortunate ones that can learn from you directly if they go to Watermill. Can you take us through this journey that they go through once they're there together? People from different parts of the world, from different backgrounds, with different mindsets, coming together to be with you and to learn something from you.
Well, it's not to learn from me, but we learn from each other. And what I try to do at Watermill is a laboratory for creative thinking, and not to have any one philosophy. To keep an open door policy, so we can bring in people that have very different political ideas from what I have, different religious or non-religious belief, someone with no formal education, someone with a high degree of education. And you can come together and you share something. And in Watermill, we prepare meals together. We garden together. And I think that's one way of bringing people close together, is by planting a flower.
You have been traveling so much for work, for encountering different audiences, different universes. Where is home for you now at this moment?
Where is home for me? It's where I am.
And is Watermill that anchor that you somehow need in order to feel home everywhere?
Watermill's an anchor, but one thing I've learned from traveling, and I've been very fortunate to travel all over the world, in the Far East, the Middle East, Latin America, North America, throughout Europe, is that my home is where I am. And people say, oh, what city or what country do you like to be in? I like to be where I am.
That's a very special lesson to be learned, I think, by everybody. I would like to ask you something about regrets, a few or more, about something that you would have liked to do and you didn't have the opportunity at the time, something that you would still like to try doing. Is there anything after this incredible body of work that you still have liked to do and didn't happen, apart from Civil Wars, which is, I think, the first thought that will probably come to your mind?
Well, I like something Gertrude Stein said. They asked her, oh, Miss Stein, what will you do next? She said, I think I'll have a glass of water. But I don't know. I think what is most important, stay open. And the Chinese say, don't run after your horse. It will come back of its own accord. And so I try to stay open now to be surprised of what's going to happen next. And that'll give me a direction.
And how do you select? I mean, for the very short period of time that we have left now, how do you select from all the proposals that you get? How do you say no and yes, respectively, to something that comes towards you?
Something I learned a long time ago is think, well, I think it would be good if I do this. Do the wrong thing. And you'll learn from doing the wrong thing. What should I not do? And then do that.
But is there something that you did and you wish you hadn't?
Yes, many things. I once directed a Chekhov play in Munich, and I've always said I didn't like naturalism, that I thought for actors to act naturalistically on stage was a lie, because for me, being on stage is something artificial. The way you speak is different, the way you walk is different, the light is different, because it's a theater, and the theater is unlike any other space. So I tried to my best ability to direct a Chekhov play in a, quote, naturalistic way. And it was a disaster. It was maybe the worst thing I ever did. But, I tried.
What about the best? If you could choose one or two or three or a few of the best things that you have done, the ones that you're most proud of, could you do it? Or is it all too personal?
It's too personal. And, you know, it's like having children. And, some of them are kicking and screaming, some are not. But I think that's what's interesting about living. It's what's interesting about life. It's always the same body. It's always the same work. It's like a tree. The tree can be in a storm, and branches can be broken. The leaves can fall off, and can be in a storm. But it's always the same tree. It's a river that's always flowing. It's always the same river. So I think the whole body of work is more about it's one thing and not many different works.
And this river called Robert Wilson is really a huge one. It's a river that has fed generations of people, has nourished so many spectators and so many artists. And I would like to ask you something about the flowing of this river now, about the fact that you are going to turn 80 next year, which is incredible. Do you ever think about that moment when you will have to say that you don't, or you don't want to, or you cannot work anymore? Or is it something that you prefer to ignore completely?
I think as long as I'm alive, I will always be working. And whether I'm more active or less active, but to me, work was not about getting dressed, going to an office, leaving at 5 o'clock in the evening, going home, watching television, scratching the dog. It was my work was about living, and I never saw any difference between waking up in the morning and dressing or walking to where I was going. It's all a part of one work. And so I think as long as I'm living, I will be working.
When you talk about people who influenced you, such as K.H. Balanchine and so many others, I sense that respect, that appreciation in your voice, in the way you mention them. How do you think people 50 years from now, or maybe even later, will think of you, of your legacy? Do you ever ask yourself that question about how something that is so much about here and now, about the immediacy of this communication, will be perceived and recalled later on?
I have no idea. I won't be there, so I have no idea.
Robert Wilson, on behalf of Sibiu Festival, on behalf of all the people who have benefited from everything that you have offered, the world of theater and the world in general, I'd like to say thank you. Thank you so much. And before we say goodbye, I would like to invite you to say something that may provide people with that glimmer of hope that is so necessary in times where many of us seem to have lost it completely. It can be a word, it can be a gesture, or it can be a moment of silence. It is entirely your choice. But I think I should end here, and I should ask you to have the last word or the last moment of silence, as it were, your choice.
Okay, so here goes.
Thank you so much. Thank you.